Desert Immigrants, Chapter 3, Part 2. Desert Immigrants. In 1912, a Times editorial asserted that Southwestern industries had found it difficult to obtain the labor they needed, and that the cry of the hour is continually far for more dependable labor. Unable to acquire American workers, so they claimed, these industries turned to El Paso as their supply center for cheap, manageable Mexican labor. Of the border cities, unquote, observed a federal labor inspector, El Paso is the only one that is a real labor depot, unquote. A significant example of the El Paso's role in meeting the labor demands of the Southwest can be seen in the activities of the city's labor contractors and regencitas, as the Mexicans called them. For types of contractors could be found in El Paso: individual contractors, El Paso-owned employment agencies, representatives of Southwestern and national corporations, the government-operated employment of offices. Individual contractors played a prominent role during the early unregulated period of Mexican immigration. Although it is difficult to understand or to determine how many operated in El Paso, a number of them were Mexicans who may have been American citizens. As early as 1891, the Mexican newspaper El Latino Americano noticed that an El Paso labor contractor, Aurelio Perez, desired to employ Mexican servants and laborers. Disregarded the prohibition of contract labor, individual contractors like Perez, as well as employment agencies and corporations, disobeyed immigration law in hiring Mexican workers. Soon after the completion of the El Paso smelter in 1887, for example, a federal court found smelter Vice President Robert S. Towns guilty of violating the 1885 labor law. According to testimony, Town and a smelter agent, had visited Santa Rosalia, Chihuahua, where they hired 40 Mexicans at 50 cents at a peso, 50 cents a day, for 3 months at the El Paso smelter. Town admitted contracting the Mexican workers, but claimed he was unaware of the new contract labor law at the time. When informed, he dismissed the Mexicans before they crossed the border. Some of the Mexicans testified that their contracts had been terminated at Paso del Norte, but that Town had told them they could still secure work at the smelter, even provided free transportation from the border at the large plant. J.W. Dickey, a smelter foreman, informed the court that the 40 Mexicans had been hired at the smelter. Dickey further stated that Town had given instructions to keep the new workers separate from the other Mexican laborers who received higher wages, so that they could not compare notes as to wages. In addition, Town had insisted that the recruits not be dismissed until they had paid off their fares from Santa Rosalia. Despite Town's claims of innocence, the jury agreed with the district attorney that the smelter executive had adopted a subterfuge to avoid law, and hence declared Towns guilty and fined him $1,000. The Times observed that the courts had pending 6 similar cases. 12 years later, officials jailed Paramino Contreras on a charge of importing contract labor into the United States. Contreras admitted to securing Mexican laborers for railroad work, but denied he got them in Ciudad Juarez. According to Contreras, he recruited among Mexicans who hung around El Paso's plaza. He acknowledged being hired by the Southern Pacific, as well as other lines, to obtain Mexican for grading, track, and section work, with no proof against him. The court acquitted him, Contreras. 3 years later, officials arrested another contractor, Ricardo Velasquez, on a similar charge. In his arraignment, the U.S. officers claimed that Velasquez had entered Warded and lured several Mexican workers for work on railroads running out of El Paso. Velasquez maintained, however, a section of foreman had instructed him to do so, that he had been ignorant of any unlawful conduct. Mexican consular authorities also observed numerous violations of the contract labor law by the turn of the century. United States Consul T.T. Edwards, for example, informed the State Department in 1905 that he had reason to believe that Mexicans contracted for work in the El Paso had been crossing the border in large numbers at El Paso. Perhaps the best-known contractor in El Paso was R.G. Gonzalez, who ran an office in the Mexican Barrio. As a Mexican, Gonzalez had an advantage over his American competitors, since he could more easily convince Mexican immigrants to sign with him. This made Gonzalez a valuable contractor, especially for the railroad, his biggest customers. In 1905, the Times reported that Gonzalez had shipped 75 Mexicans to Douglas and Bisbee to work on the Southwestern Railroad in southern Arizona. 3 years later, he received a telegram requesting 1,000 Mexican laborers immediately for work in the construction of the Galveston, Harrisburg, and San Antonio Railroad. Although most of his business came from southwestern lines, Gonzalez had also had contacts in other areas. He informed a reporter in 1907 that he just completed a contract with a Midwestern line to supply 2,500 Mexican sections hands for summer work. Although Gonzalez and other Mexican labor contractors provided jobs to immigrants in search for work, they sometimes came in for criticism. El Corren El Norte of El Paso, in an article entitled Las Empeñadoras, the contractors attacked the labor contractors for their maltreatment and abuse of Los Porobos Zaramotos, the poor, uncultured Mexicans, and warned that it would notify the police of these practices. Either the police paid no attention to El Claron, or the newspaper failed to follow through on its threat, for Gonzalez and other contractors continued in business. Longtime El Paso resident Jose Cruz Bercerilla recalls that by 1920, contractors sent out every day numerous enganches, gangs of contact labor, of between 50 and 100 men. Although it is not known if Mexican workers had to pay El Paso labor contractors, Jesus Garcia, who arrived in San Antonio in the early 1920s, remembered paying $1 to a rangista for railroad work. Besides individual contractors, various employment agencies took advantage of the desire for Mexican labor throughout the Southwest and in other sections of the country. The survey's Samuel Bryan reported in 1912 that El Paso's employment agencies are well organized and supply a large number of immigrants to the various railroad companies operating in the Southwest and to employees in the other industries, unquote. Most agencies operating as close as possible to the border to contract. The Mexicans, as they entered El Paso, Murray, and Reedy, for example, had their office at 916 South El Paso, and advertised in 1906 for 1,000 men to work in new railroad construction. It needed laborers, drillers, tunnelmen, rockmen, hammermen, trackmen, teamsters, and section hands, and offered $2 a day plus free transportation. Murray and Reedy placed men with mining companies in their region. Although railroads hired most of their Mexicans, in 1910, the Times disclosed that several hundred Mexicans had been sent daily to various parts of the country by employment firms, and that some went as far as Illinois and Nebraska. All railroads into El Paso had placed large orders with the contractors. One agency provided nearly 1,500 Mexicans in a few days and had requested for an additional $5,000. El Paso historian Calderas remembered that such agencies as the Zarate and Avena, the Hanlon Supply Company, and the Home Supply Company contracted laborers from the Santa Fe and Southern Pacific Railroads. Now, these laborers, according to Calderas, were hired for $1 a day. One correspondent further noted that employment agencies had made much of their profits by charging board on the trip from their border to the immigrants workers work destination. In addition, charging board on the trip from their border to the immigrants' work. In addition, agencies held foot and supply concessions at company stores to supply each for such provisions. Employers deducted money from workers' first wages. The demand for Mexican laborers became so great that the agency's biggest problems was insufficient numbers to fill their orders. The condition worsened after the financial panic of 1907. During the Depression, railroads repatriated large numbers of Mexicans for lack of work. Consequently, when good times returned, labor demands exceeded the supply. Nevertheless, the Dillingham Commission revealed that between July 1908 and February 1909, 5 labor agencies in El Paso transported 16,471 Mexicans to several railroads. P.W. Geary announced during the summer of 1910 that he had an order for 1,000 men for railroad work in central Texas and southern Oklahoma, but he could not secure enough Mexicans to fill it. The revolution in Mexico also hurt the contractors, and one agent reported in 1911 that his firm had been unable to answer a demand for 4,000 railroad laborers in Arizona. In New Mexico and California, another stated that he had an appeal for 500 workers in New York, but could send only 50 men. That year, a time survey of all the labor agencies in El Paso revealed that they had on hand requests for a total of 9,000 railroad workers. If these could not be filled by Mexicans, the contractors stated that they and the railroads would have to search elsewhere for their labor needs. Fortunately for them, this became unnecessary because the disruption of Mexican immigration proved to be only temporary. Because of larger orders, employment offices engaged in intense competition along the border. To defeat their opponents, some of them dispatched Mexican agents to neighboring Chihuahua, where they promised laborers from $1.25 to $2 a day for railroad work if they migrated to El Paso and signed with their agency. If successful, those agents received from 50 cents and up for every man they secured. The agents received from 50 cents and up to every man they secured. I reread that. The agencies claimed that such tactics did not violate the contract labor law. In their zeal to hire Mexican workers, Arizona agencies even encouraged Mexicans to cross illegally rather than go through port of entry. In El Paso, agent believed that the situation in Arizona resulted from the lack of immigration stations along the border. However, this was not necessary. In El Paso, where adequate immigration facilitated existed, their agents denied infringements of the contract labor law, but admitted employing Mexican in Ciudad Juarez, where immigrants agreed to sign with particular firms on their arrival in El Paso. The competition became so aggressive that the agencies stationed Mexican employees at the Santa Fe Bridge, where they literally pounced on the immigrants as they crossed the border. "Come, I'll get you a job," unquote. El Paso resident Mauricio Cordero remembers the labor agents appealing to income Mexicans. Come, I'll hire you." unquote. The Times reported that strong and healthy young Mexicans did not need much money to enter the United States, since as soon as they stepped foot on American soil, labor contractors hired them. This led to the newspaper to give immigrants the title of King Peon. In fact, the despised and lowly peon becomes something of an autocrat as soon as he crossed the line. His wants are provided for and a close watch kept upon him to see what he does when he not get to see that he does not get lost when ready for shipment. Each is provided with a number, and they are herded down to the Union Station. Not unlike cattle, it is needless to say that Pullman cars are not provided for their transportation. The scene at the bridge became almost lucrative at times. In September 1907, the police arrested 11 Mexican agents at the Santa Fe crossing on charges of, quote, pushing their business into zealousy for blocking streets and for disturbing the peace. While most of them pleaded not guilty, Officer Rubio testified that there had been but 10 or 12 Mexican laborers surrounding by at least 14 puller ins of as many employment agencies, and that each agency had seized on his victim. One tried to pull his laborers one way and another. One had a laborer by the coat, another by his sleeve, and another by his hair, each voicing in loud tones with a particular, quote, noise like a rough house, unquote, the advantages of his particular agency in a compact mass. A group swayed back and forth, completely blocking the sidewalk in South El Paso Street, as well as attracting quite a crowd. According to the police report, additional agents from the Homes Supply Agency arrived and secured all the laborers for their office. After the court inquired about the condition of the Mexican immigrants, it fined each agent $1. The police, however, could also be of assistance to labor contractors. Although no similar information exists for El Paso, one San Antonio recruiter years later admitted he had contracted Mexicans jailed in Fort Worth for having no jobs. If I get you out, will you work? The contractor asked the Mexicans. They said yes, and I have taken them out and put them to work. Between 1927 and 1930, the economist Paul S. Taylor compiled data for his seminal studies on Mexican labor in the United States. Several El Paso labor contractors talked to him about their early activities. R.P. Desrt of the Desrt Avena Labor Agency recalled that his company started providing Mexican labor in 1902. Two railroads between El Paso and Chicago, another agent at the Desrt Avena office, also remember that whereas in 1904 the agency had transported from El Paso about 700 Mexicans, 1 year later it sent out 1,300, and the numbers continued to multiply. W.H. Talbot of the L.H. Manning Company, with offices in El Paso, Tucson, and Los Angeles, informed Taylor that the decade 1910 to 1920 represented a, quote, fill-up period, when Mexicans replaced other nationalists as the Southwest major labor source. According to Talbot, the Southern Pacific employed Mexicans from El Paso to San Jose, and Stockton Bay G. Carley of the Hanlon Supply Company, which began contracting Mexican labor in 1912, stated that his firm preferred Mexicans because you can fire one or two without losing your whole gang. C.R. Howard of the Homes Supply Company further stressed the attraction of Mexican labor to Southwestern employers. Quote, Mexicans are not subject to agitators, Howard commented. They're not organized, they're peaceable, and will work on the desert or anywhere the Santa Fe wants to put them. Finally, an agent, the Holmes Company, summarized the value of Mexican immigrant workers, especially to El Paso contractors. El Paso is primarily a labor market. LA is secondary. Mexican labor is good. It is the best common labor in California. It isn't rapid, either mentally or physically, but it is steady. The Mexicans will take a vacation from their work every once in a while. The Mexican father says, my son will take care of me in my old age. The Mexicans are peculiarly adapted to agriculture. They are good miners and the best track labor available. In addition to individual contractors and employment offices, the railroad and other industries of the Southwest had their own labor agents in El Paso. The Southern Pacific opened an office in 1894, and its agents crossing the border encouraged Mexicans to enter the United States where they could find employment. Once in El Paso, the agency contracted them and promised the immigrants $1.25 per day as well as free passage to the border. The Southern Pacific also had offices in Tucson, Los Angeles, and Wilco, Arizona, that supplied the railroad line from Bakersville to El Paso with Mexican laborers. In return, the railroad paid each agency $1 per head. At times, railroad representatives also utilized the help wanted columns of the newspaper to advertise for workers. One such ad in 1901 read, wanted 100 men on railroad work. A year later, 4 different railroads had agents in El Paso during 1 week looking for able-bodied men for work in California, Colorado, Oklahoma, and East Texas. The Santa Fe man reported in 1908 that he needed 200 men for track work in Kansas, Colorado, and California. The Southern Pacific and the Rock Island representatives stated they could use about 500 more men. The roads were, as a rule, work Mexican laborers. The Times commented, there seems to be a scarcity of that kind of labor at present. One such period occurred during Francisco Maduro's siege of Ciudad Juarez in the spring of 1911, when the number of Mexican immigrants to El Paso declined. As a result, one railroad agent considered a more drastic measure to obtain workers. L. H. Manning of Tucson, a representative of the Southern Pacific, as well as other lines in Arizona, New Mexico, and California, arrived in April searching for 2,000 laborers. When told that Maduro might disband his army in a few days, he captured Juarez. Manning stated that he would be prepared to take the whole of Maduro's army and stake the men to picks and shovels if they were ready to get on the job. Apparently, some of Maduro's men accepted the Manning's offer, or at least more Mexicans arrived in El Paso. For 2 days later, 150 Mexicans left El Paso on a Southwest Pacific train for work in Arizona. During World War I, railroads outside of the Southwest also had their men. In El Paso, the agent of the Pennsylvania Railroad, for example, announced in 1916 that he sought 200 Mexicans for a labor experiment. Moreover, owing to the 1917 immigrant restriction demands, the demand for Mexican labor heightened. One agent believed the Mexican labor had become scarce, and yet the railroads could use between 5,000 to 10,000 Mexicans. After the Department of Labor ruled that Mexicans could enter the United States for railroad work, the Baltimore and Ohio, along with the Eastern lines, quickly dispatched agents to the border. Besides being used as manual laborers, Mexicans were employed as strike bearers. by some of the railroads, such as the Chicago and Alton Railroad, which imported Mexicans to break a strike in 1918, only to have the Mexicans refuse to work after they learned of the dispute. Agricultural interests took advantage of the 1917 and 1918 waivers and contracted workers in El Paso. The Continental Sugar Company of Toledo, Ohio, sent C.J. Pinto to the border to secure 1,000 Mexican laborers. Although a reported embargo on labor from Mexico and the government of General Venustiano Carranza prevented him from doing so immediately. Pinto stressed that the labor problem is a serious one, and getting hands for as large a concern as ours is a big job. According to the labor agent, had company required 500 laborers to work 25,000 acres of sugar beets in Ohio and Michigan. Previously, labor had been plentiful in the East and Midwest, but since the war, the company had turned to Mexico, and now, apparently, that is cut off. A few days later, Pinto's arrival, other sugar beet representatives came to El Paso. The Herald reported that hundreds of Mexican agricultural laborers had been admitted for the sugar beet fields of Idaho, Colorado, and Utah, and that a group of them had left El Paso for southern Utah, accompanied by agents of the Utah-Idaho Sugar Company. These contractors had been in session for several days with immigration officials arranging the recruitment of workers. Their negotiation completed, the sugar men left. In 1919, the Times observed that 150 Mexicans from Ciudad Juarez, with their families, furniture, and pets, had been hired by a Colorado sugar beet company for work in beet fields and sugar refineries. However, one agent of the sugar beet industry did not have as much success. Mexican authorities arrested him for soliciting Mexicans at the International Bridge. Carranza officials claimed that Antonio Salas had illegally contracted the Mexicans on the Juarez side of the border. Although witnesses told Herald reporter that the recorder had remained at least 10 feet from the borderline, the Mexicans released Salas along with another agent who had been arrested on the same charge a few days before. By 1919, various sugar beets interests operated labor agencies in El Paso, including the Great Western Sugar Company, Holly Sugar Company, Belmond Isle Company, Utah-Idaho Company, Amalgamated Sugar Company, and Dominion Sugar Company of Ontario, Canada. The last and least important type of labor contractors consisted of government-operated labor agencies that were organized out of the loud clamor of Mexican labor during the war years. The Texas, because of labor statistics, for example, employed labor commissioners to assist the Texas industries, especially agriculture, to secure Mexican workers. In June 1918, Tom Bell and M.A. Dominiquez, deputies of the Bureau, appeared in El Paso to arrange with Mexican officials in Ciudad Juarez for a supply of 3,000 workers from Chihuahua for the fields of North and Central Texas. That same year, an office of the United States Employment Bureau of the Department of Labor, in cooperation with El Paso officials, opened in the business of the City Hall. It proposed to supply the labor needs of El Paso and vicinity throughout its vicinity, although it's also delivered workers to railroads such as the Santa Fe. The Bureau placed Mexicans as well as some Americans as farm laborers, carpenters, manual laborers, stenographers, and clerical assistants. Yet its major service was the employment of Mexican domestics in El Paso homes. Figures released by the Bureau in November 1919 indicate that Mexican women accounted for most of its applicants during the first 19 workdays of that month. The Bureau interviewed 14 American women and directed 6 of them to work. On the other hand, it interviewed 1,740 Mexican women during the same time and dispatched 1,326 of them to work. The Bureau had 647 American male applicants, but found jobs for only 69. Of 869 Mexican men, it sent 176 to jobs. Besides the El Paso office, the Department of Labor operated 23 similar ones in Texas and New Mexico, 18 in Texas and 5 in New Mexico. The people of El Paso and vicinity, stated Henry W. Walker of the local agency, are just beginning to appreciate the scope of the work undertaken by the Department of Labor. In opening free employment for offices throughout the country, besides the Bureau, a special El Paso office of the Department of Labor opened in September 1918. The department was considered this post essential in order to assist Mexican laborers as they entered the United States and to provide for their welfare after they had gone to work. Despite the Department of Labor's concern, Mexican immigrants as well as Mexican consular officials in the United States at times complained of deceptions and mistreatment of workers by border inspectors and labor contractors. Upon crossing in 1910, several Mexicans informed the Mexican consul in El Paso of an immigration official's attack on a fellow worker. The Mexican protested that everyday immigration officers at the Santa Fe Bridge crossing committed abuses against Mexicans desiring to enter the United States for work. According to the workers, the officer in this particular case detained a poor Mexican worker and demanded the surrender of a bottle he possessed. The bottle contained nothing. The immigrants told the consul, but when their friend refused to give it up, the officer escorted him into the inspection station. In a little while, explains the Mexicans, we heard blows, and to our surprise, we witnessed the officer striking our countryman with a thick stick and stating he was going to deliver him to the authorities, who would imprison him for 5 years. The immigrants appealed to the consul to intervene in behalf of their arrested compañero, and believing that similar attacks would continue, requested that their complaint had be sent to the Mexican government. 5 years later, moreover, the Mexican consul at El Paso wrote the Secretary of Foreign Relations in Mexican City that quite often there had come to his attention cases of fraudulent offers involving Mexican immigrants. In one instance, a railroad agent had offered a large number of Mexican laborers 6 months' work in Philadelphia at $1.80 per day, including free round-trip transportation from the border. The consul had learned, however, that the railroad had repudiated the agreement and refused free transportation back to the border. This is not the first case of this kind, emphasized the consul, and I therefore wish to urge Mexicans to investigate the facts before contracting. The consul further suggested that his warning be published in Mexico City's newspapers so that potential immigrants would not be deceived by flattering offers and leave our country. To protect against the non-fulfillment of labor agreements Between immigrants and labor contractors, Consul Soriano Bravo advised in 1917 that workers obtained written contracts, although the consul believed that Mexican immigration should be limited due to increased population pressures on Mexican border cities. Soriano Bravo hoped that those who crossed the frontier would be aware of their rights in a memo addressed to, quote, the Mexican workers. The consul stressed that every immigrant insist on a written agreement stipulation, the duration of the contract, the wages to be paid, and free transportation back to El Paso. Soriano Bravo offered to consul immigrants about contracts. In addition, the Mexican diplomat wrote to all El Paso labor contractors about the necessity of a written contract and enclosed an English translation of sample contract. I would suggest, unquote, he told the contractors, that you put into use this form and furnish every Mexican laborer that you engage with one of them, unquote. Besides specifying the work period, wages, and transportation, the sample contract provide that in the case of a job-related injury, the employer would transfer the worker to an adequate hospital. Unfortunately, the efforts of Sereno Bravo, as well as other Mexican consuls along the border, appear to have had little to impact, and few, if any, labor contractors gave written contracts to Mexican workers. However, economic instability in Mexico and the Mexicans' need for jobs overcame the hardship associated with immigration to the United States, which, with such readily available army of labor, the different types of contractors transferred to work thousands of Mexicans throughout the Southwest, as well as other sections of the country. The Dillingham Commission, in its investigation of specific Western industries, reported that in 1910, foreign-born Mexicans represented 7.1% of all workers in metalliferous mining, including 26.4% in Arizona, and in Western smelting and refining, foreign-born Mexicans were 12.8% of the total, with 60.5% in Arizona. By 1917, miners in the Grand Canyon State numbered 16,000. As early as 1904, moreover, a Mexican newspaper in the city, El Paso del Norte, had noted that various Mexican families had left the city to work in Mississippi plantations, and in 1911, a news dispatch from New Orleans stated that an increase in Mexican laborers had occurred in Louisiana and other southern states. According to the report, Mexicans had found, along with Italians, to do best adapted to the hot Louisiana climate, and their work had been more than satisfactory. They labored in cane fields, sugar refineries, lumber, and turpentine camps. And as many workers, furthermore, Spanish is heard almost frequently as English. On the docksides where Mexican and Central America laborers principally are employed, a valuable asset of the Mexicans, the dispatch concluded, was their ability to get along with black workers. Despite the fact that the Mexican was displacing the Negro in many occupations. The dispatch reported, there seems to be no resentment on the part of the black race. One of the reasons for the esteem in which the Mexican laborers are held is due to the fact that they are not divided into factions among themselves, as are the Italians, and still can labor side by side with Negroes without friction, a condition impossible between the American and laborers and the colored races. Mexicans could also be found in Midwestern meatpacking houses and related industries. In one plant in Nebraska City, The Mexicans had displaced so many American workers that a campaign to get rid of the Mexican began. Warnings posted on buildings' walls, it read, if you are a Mexican, leave the city by Sunday night. This wide geographic mobility of the Mexicans reflected to a large degree their employment by the railroads, which distributed them throughout various sections of the country. By 1912, they were the main source of labor for railroads west and south of Kansas City and could be found in large numbers in Missouri, Iowa, and Illinois. An immigration officer in Houston recalled in the late 1920s that by 1915, south and west at St. Louis, practically all the railroad laborers were Mexicans, but not much north except on the Burlington and Rock Island. From railroad construction and maintenance, the Mexicans often shifted to other jobs in agriculture or industry. Having entered as an economic migrant, the Mexican remained one in the United States. Although Mexican immigrant workers adjusted to harsh working and living conditions and became indispensable to the economic development of the Southwest, and in particular El Paso, they nevertheless felt the burden of their toil, reflecting their relationships with labor contractors as well as their labor on the railroads. Some composed songs conveying their worst feelings about the work north of the border. One such song, immigrant worker, entitled Los Enganchados, the Hooked One, translated. On the 28th day of April, the important day when we left, they took us out of contract labor. Where we left El Paso at 2 a.m, I asked the boss contractor if we were going to Louisiana. We arrived at Laguna without any hope. I asked the boss if we were going to Oklahoma. We arrived on the first day, and on the second day began to work. With our picks in our hands, we set out tramping. Some unloaded rails and some unloaded ties, and others of my companions threw out thousands of curses. Those who knew the work went repairing the jack with sledgehammers and shovels, throwing earth up the track. 8 crowbars lined up. We followed, disgusted, to shouts and signs. We remained indifferent, said Jesus El Coyote, as if we wanted to weep. It would be better to be in Juarez even if we were without work. Those verses were composed by a poor Mexican to spread the word about the American system. This is the end of Chapter 3, Part 2. Thank you.